All right, so it says we are live. Hello, everybody. My name is Carly. I'm the instructional coordinator here at Los Luceros Historic Site, and welcome to Mesa Talks. Mesa Talks is a joint effort between Mesa Prieta Petroglyph Project and Los Luceros Historic Site. And today we have Nick Saenz here to give his lecture. So Nick, if you'd like to introduce yourself, say anything about yourself you want. And for our audience members watching here, this is kind of a new way that we're broadcasting. So please let us know if you can hear both of us, if you can see the screen, all that kind of stuff. We're doing our best here with this fancy technology. So Nick, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Carly. It's a pleasure to be here. This is a very cool public sort of interactive opportunity to learn more about so many of the very cool historic sites that exist in the state of New Mexico. So my name is Nick Saenz. As was mentioned, I'm an associate professor of history at Adams State University in southern Colorado. And over the past spring semester, I had an opportunity to devote a sabbatical to learning more about the 1779 campaign against the Comanches, as it's often referred to. Sometimes it's often referred to as well as the ANZA campaign, though ANZA really wasn't the only guy responsible for coordinating that very fascinating event. In truth, it was more of a coalition led in some measure by ANZA, but really with significant involvement from a number of indigenous groups, in addition to the Pueblos themselves, also the Utes and the Apaches. And so these groups together were coordinating an offensive against the Comanches. But the focus of today's talk is not that particular campaign, but I really just wanted to present why it is that I developed an interest in Los Luceros, and why the talk today will focus on this era of the Comanche expansion into that part of northern New Mexico. So the Los Luceros Historic Site really figures ultimately at the heart of that story. And so I spent some time kind of reflecting on where the Los Luceros story intersected with that history. And that's what I have to present today. So the purpose really is to, in the first place, give you a sense of the crisis facing the area of Los Luceros in the latter part of the 18th century, and then to explore some of the potential changes that might have taken place at Los Luceros in that time period, really in response to the Comanche expansion. And then ultimately to finish with a look at why the traditional dance known as Los Comanches emerged from this moment of conflict, a period of collaboration by some measure, and ultimately various forms of interaction between the various peoples of northern New Mexico in the later part of the 18th century. So Carly, if you would, take us to the next slide. So what does Los Luceros look like in the early 1700s, the 18th century, right? In that period, Los Luceros is a term that nobody really would have been using. The very early history of the site would have been one dominated by the Pueblo of Fiogue, which lies today in ruins abutting the historic site itself. But in the records for the Spanish colonial period, it enters the record around 1703, when in that year, a captain by the name of Sebastián Martín Serrano was given a grant ultimately to settle in that area. And so that's really kind of the first recorded instance we have of a Spanish settler moving into the area. So again, a long-standing history of indigenous, specifically Pueblo inhabitation, but in terms of the early Spanish era settlement of the site, dates to the 18th century, so well into, by this period, 100 years of Spanish presence in the region. But it was a turbulent time to be settling this particular part of New Mexico. It was very much on the northern cusp, the frontier of the territory. And by about 1748, it's clear that the site was abandoned. Now, the records say that it was because of Utes. In this time period, there was a close association between the Utes and Comanches. For a time, the two groups had raided and traded together in the area of northern New Mexico. But by about 1748, those two groups are separate. And so it is possible that it truly was a Ute attack that led to the abandonment of the site, though it is also possible that it might have been a Comanche attack, and the settlers took the Comanches for Utes, and so the records reference the Utes. But within about 2 years, it appears as though the site is re-inhabited once again. There's records that point to the existence of about 44 families by that point, numbering in total about 364 people. So the area around what is Los Luceros today is being settled as a plaza, that is a kind of rough fortified site for settlers, that sometimes is referred also as a hacienda. In 1774, so flash forward another 25 years or so, there is a Spanish description of New Mexico composed by Pedro Alonso O'Crowley, a not so Spanish-sounding name there. O'Crowley's family were of Irish extraction, like so many Irish families moved into the Spanish Empire as there was persecution within the British Empire controlling Ireland during that time. O'Crowley's family moved into Spain. O'Crowley has a prominent service career in the Spanish Empire, but again in 1774 he pens this description of New Mexico, and it offers a really nice description of what today we think of as the Los Luceros site. And do note here in the slide that is O'Crowley. So I'm going to read a little bit of a passage that O'Crowley provides regarding the site, and that's the man who penned these words. He wrote, "There are some Spanish families at the Hacienda de la Soledad del Rio Arriba del Norte," so that's what Los Luceros was known as in that time period, "which is between north and west of the capital, namely Santa Fe, and 12 leagues from it. They do some same sort of work as those places already mentioned." So he talks a little bit in his report about various sites in New Mexico. Namely, he says that they farm wheat and so-called Indian corn and herd sheep, and are under the spiritual care of a missionary who lives in San Juan de los Caballeros. So in this time period, there weren't many priests, but essentially there was a Franciscan missionary in the neighboring pueblo that in that time period was known as San Juan de los Caballeros. Today we know it better as Oke'ewinge, but it's one of the first accounts we really have that there's something going on at this site beyond the sporadic mentions we get in the documentary record before that. So in the 1770s, we know there's sort of a critical mass of pobladores who are inhabiting this site. They appear to be under periodic attack from nomadic groups, probably both the Utes and the Comanches in this period, occasionally maybe even some Apache attacks, but ultimately this is a sort of rough, challenging business of settling on the frontier of New Mexico in this time period. Carly, if you would advance it. 2 years later, we have another description provided by Fray ATANASIO Dominguez, famously associated with the Domínguez Escalante expedition. He conducts a review of the missions in New Mexico right before he leaves for that very long sojourn through the wilderness. But as part of this expansive recollection of his visit throughout northern New Mexico, specifically looking at missions, he too talks about this area of New Mexico that today we think of as Los Luceros. He writes, "Rio Arriba is a league north of the mission," so referring to San Juan de los Caballeros, "and up the same plain. It consists of a number of ranchos, like those mentioned before. These settlers live by the help of the aforementioned river, namely the Rio Grande, with whose waters they make fruitful the very little fertile lands that the meadows of the river offer. As such, they produce copious harvests. There are 3 or 4 little fruit orchards of apples, peaches, and apricots," and of course visitors to Los Luceros today would notice that the continuation of that orchard tradition today. "In this little place there is a small chapel of Our Lady of Solitude. Its patron was one Sebastian Martin, who I've mentioned already. Today his substitute and heir is a son of his called Marcial Martin. In the mission's jurisdiction, we find Rio Arriba. The citizens of this Rio Arriba are of different classes. Some are masters, others servants. and still others are their own masters and servants. They all speak the local Spanish. And he gives us a slightly different count in terms of who would have been living there. He records 51 families, so more families, though a fewer overall number of about 299 individuals. So probably holding steady. This is, again, just 2 years after O'Crowley's description of the site. O'Crowley probably would have been pinning his account from Mexico proper to the south, from one of the towns much further to the south from New Mexico. And so in many ways, perhaps the Dominguez account is a more faithful record of what's going on in this time period. But by the 1770s, the period I'm really going to be focusing on today, we have a good number of families and a location that is often referred to as La Soledad, as Rio Arriba. Again, the site today we think about as Los Luceros, though that name really becomes more associated with the site in the 19th century. So Carly, if you want to move forward once again. So how is it that the Comanches get into this area of New Mexico? The first Spanish records to talk about the Comanches reference a 1706 threat to Taos. It appears as though, and various records suggest as much, that the Utes actually introduced the Comanches to New Mexico, specifically at Taos Pueblo. The Comanches are most likely looking to expand their horse numbers, and the Utes have already developed a thriving trade relationship by this point with Taos Pueblo. They know that there are horses to be had there, and so they bring the Comanches to Taos. Taos becomes the focal point of Comanche interest in the region. Eventually, there will also be major trade centers established at Pecos and also Piquerí Pueblo, but Taos remains sort of a constant. It is easy to get into New Mexico through Taos from the Sangre de Cristos. There's a number of passes that allow entry into the eastern zone of the province, but at some point in the 18th century, the Comanches appear to start using a location known often in the scholarship as the Vargas crossing site, a reference to Diego de Vargas's 1694 crossing of the Rio Grande north of modern-day New Mexico in what is today Colorado. That site allows for a ford of the Rio Grande. If you think about the geography of the region, right, there's a very big gorge cutting through the northern part of New Mexico that doesn't allow for a lot of movement between east and west. But at that site, where the gorge actually begins at the north, it's possible to move into the sort of western area of New Mexico. If you've had an opportunity to learn a little bit about some of the recent work done by Severin Fowles and his team at the Vista Verde site in what is today Rio Grande del Norte National Monument, you know that that was an area of frequent Comanche visits throughout the 18th century. I know Sev Fowles' work has gotten a lot of attention, most recently appearing on some PBS specials, and so you might have already heard something about that site. But by about 1767, the problem of repeated Comanche forays into the region has become significant enough that the then newly minted governor of New Mexico, Pedro Fermín de Mendinueta, actually sends a 50-person garrison to inhabit a site at the foot of San Antonio Mountain. And I have San Antonio Mountain there on the bottom. If you've driven along 285 into Colorado, you've noticed this sort of very mild mountain standing by itself. That is San Antonio Mountain. From the base of San Antonio Mountain, you can look eastward and take a look at that crossing. And so it appears as though the Spanish are trying to stop the Comanches from moving into the western part of New Mexico, using that crossing at the 1694 Vargas crossing site, because ultimately behind San Antonio Mountain is the area around Ojo Caliente. So the Ojo Caliente Valley in this period, the middle part of the 18th century, is being settled. It is exposed, now being sort of the northernmost point of New Mexico to attack by the Comanches. And so the Spanish are taking efforts to prevent repeated entry of Comanches into their northernmost territories. And it's really through the Ojo Caliente gateway that the Comanches could curve south into the Chama River Valley, and from there to its confluence with the Rio Grande near Okeawinge Pueblo, and to the neighboring side of, again, what today we think of as Los Luceros, in this period, what is often referred to either as La Soledad or Rio Arriba. Carly, if you would, on to the next slide. So then enters into the picture a personality in history known as Cuerno Verde. Cuerno Verde is somewhat of a mystery, remains very much a mystery, also a little bit of a myth and a legend. I have an image here from a streetscape in Walsenburg, Colorado. And so those of you who have visited southern Colorado might have seen reference to Cuerno Verde throughout places like Pueblo and Colorado City and Walsenburg. I'll say a little bit more about Cuerno Verde here in a moment, but I just want to pause for a second and point to the idea that there's been kind of a myth and a legend that has emerged around Cuerno Verde. We actually don't know if there were multiple Cuerno Verdes or just one. He appears in the records at various points, beginning at around 1768, but then ultimately dies as many as 3 separate deaths. And so we don't know if there are terrible records kept by the Spanish that don't actually recount the exploits of Cuerno Verde, or if in fact what's going on is a succession of Comanche leaders who perhaps take up the same headdress, and so in succession wear it, and so the Spanish identify those various individuals by this name. But in 1768, there's about 24 Comanches who raid Ojo Caliente. Remember, a year before, Mendinueta is trying to stop this exact thing from happening by posting that 50-person garrison. It appears on the occasion of this attack, the Spanish have kind of given up that garrison. It doesn't appear as though it's functioning as a sort of protective perimeter for the colony. 24 Comanches attack Ojo Caliente and the surrounding valley. All but one, notably, are killed, including among that number a leader that by some measure was very close to Cuerno Verde. Cuerno Verde returns shortly thereafter in the month of October with as many as 500 Comanches who wreak havoc on the Ojo Caliente Valley. This is the moment in which Cuerno Verde appears in the record. Mendinueta, again, the then governor, references what he often sort of describes as a type of petty king who has raised himself up among the Comanches. Mendinueta's description talks about a single horn on his headdress that kind of protruded right from the forehead. You'll notice again that mythological, legendary sort of portrayal I have from this mural in Walsenburg portrays a sort of 2-horned headdress, but it appears as though it was probably one, though the headdress either did not survive to the present time or is buried in one of a number of possible European museums today, or kind of on the hunt for it right now. Hopefully it'll materialize. But Cuerno Verde supposedly died in 1768 in this October attack on Ojo Caliente, but perhaps one of the members of that group takes up this headdress and starts wearing it from that point forward, or just as likely, he did not actually die. The Spanish thought he did, and he lives to fight another day. But Cuerno Verde becomes this kind of specter challenging New Mexico during the late 1760s and into the 1770s. And so he's sort of the specter haunting New Mexico, this recurring figure that poses a real challenge to the ability of Spanish Empire to push northward. If you've been following recent history surrounding the Comanche, you know there's been kind of a turn to talking about the Comanches as an empire. So to put that framework differently, we have kind of 2 empires here butting up against one another. We have a number of other people kind of caught in the crossfire here: Utes, Jicarilla, Apache, Pueblos, and others, but the Spanish and the Comanches are really facing this collision of sorts that appears in the 1770s to be on the side more so of the Comanches. The Comanches have the upper hand, perhaps to the degree that there would have been a consolidated leadership led by this figure of Cuerno Verde. So Cuerno Verde in the 1770s might have been the greatest threat to, again, this area we think of today as Los Luceros. Carly, if you would advance once again. Thank you. So what might we expect at the site today we think of as Los Luceros in this time period? Like many other sites in New Mexico, and I'll give a description of some of these other sites here in a moment, it was probably the case that this hacienda that I referenced a moment ago, the same one described by O'Crowley and Dominguez, had a number of innovations that were built into it, maybe some additional constructions kind of as a perimeter to the site. The degree to which it was consolidated, we're not sure. Plazas in this time period often were a very sort of centralized structure, kind of quadrilateral with 4 sides, with no windows on the exterior, and interior open to the skies that allowed for the collection of herds and other livestock. But there probably would have been a number of towers of a protective form constructed, maybe even some bastions protruding from those walls. We get some sense of the fact that there might have been some of this sort of construction going on at Los Luceros in a will dated 1765. So in that year, the wife of Sebastian Martin died on site, and among the possessions were listed an esmeril. And this is not the one you would see today if you visit the Los Luceros site, but there is one hidden away in the principal hacienda that you get to view today, which is different from the one I'm talking about in the 18th century. This particular sort of gun was a sort of innovation from the sea. So you'll notice this type of gun in esmeril had a sort of a post at the bottom. This allowed it to be locked into a chute and would allow the gun to essentially pivot. It was breech loading, so it wasn't, as quick a firing mechanism as we might think of today with like a machine gun or something of that sort. But this is a considerable investment on the part of the Martin family to protect this hacienda. The very fact that it appears in the records point to the fact that increasingly a site like La Soledad, like Rio Riva, is under continued threat from the Comanches, who pose a real continuing challenge to the ability of settlers at this location to subsist. Carly, if you would, on to the next slide that looks at TAOS, because I think TAOS also gives us some really useful insights for understanding just how severe the Comanche expansion was in this period to the ability of settlers to subsist along this neck of the woods of the Rio Grande. So just to give you a sense of what I mean, again, TAOS is one of those sites featuring early encounters with the Comanches, reaching all the way back to that 1706 moment of first contact. In 1760, there is a trade fair at TAOS that by some measure goes horribly awry. Supposedly at Taos Pueblo, there is a scalp dance that features a number of Comanche scalps displayed prominently by Taos Pueblos during this dance. The Comanches understandably take this as a great offense and return a year later. And what happens a year later is one of the more sort of tragically described episodes in sort of late colonial Spanish New Mexico. In 1761, there's this raid on Taos, but the Comanches, for the most part, are deflected from Taos. Taos is fairly defensible with its walls and towers. I'll talk about those here in a moment. And they go further south to a sort of hacienda plaza-like defensive structure owned by the Villalpando family. The patriarch of that family happens to be away at the moment, but for many settlers, or pobladores, as they're often referred to in the records, around this hacienda, they take refuge inside this plaza. So you can think of this as kind of a larger compound, again, kind of a fortress, perhaps protected by guns, that is designed to protect those persons who cannot otherwise take refuge in Taos Pueblo because it's a ways away, or the neighboring New Mexican plaza. The Comanches attack this particular site. They prove effective at getting underneath one of the towers and setting fire to the structure from inside, so ultimately breaching its exteriors. Ultimately, according to Bernardo de Miera y Pacheco, a famous map maker from the time period, who I'll talk about a little bit later as well, about 80 persons are killed in this particular encounter, and about 64 women and children are hauled off into captivity. So a pretty disastrous moment here. Again, life on the frontier would have been very difficult, but we have moments of very positive, peaceful interaction. One of the things that might have been driving the push of the Comanches into the region is a sort of environmental crisis. So it appears as though the 1770s are low on rainfall. Now, if there's low rainfall, that means very little grass. Very little grass means smaller or diminishing bison herds. This is very difficult then for the Comanches to subsist on. They turn instead to trade. As they encounter a very negative trade experience at Taos in 1760, they instead start to up their raiding game. And so from this window from about 1760 to about 1786, we see kind of the peak of these Comanche raids. Again, the 1770s are the very worst of that. You can plot an environmental paleoclimatic curve, just looking at that time period as being absolutely at the worst stage of this environmental crisis. In neighboring Taos Plaza, the pobladores there actually abandon the site with permission of the governor. They move into Taos Pueblo. Dominguez, when he's visiting Taos in 1776, so the same chronicler I referenced a moment ago, mentions that there are fortified walls at Taos Pueblo. They have towers. There's an entire block of buildings that are now housing the settlers. So essentially there's kind of this refugee exodus from around into Taos Pueblo. If you see in this image, there are a number of darkened corners, and in even smaller print, the word tower is next to it. This is actually a sketch drawn from the National Historic Register listing for Taos Pueblo. And what I really want you to see there are those towers that are constructed at the edge of the Pueblo. They appear to have been built in this time period, perhaps an elaboration on pre-existing structures of this kind at the Pueblo. You won't see much of them today, in part because of the dismantling that occurred after the 1847 Taos Rebellion. But ANZA, and I'll talk more about ANZA here in a moment, Juan Bautista de ANZA, governor of New Mexico in 1779, says that after an attack on Taos Pueblo, the Taos Pueblo was able to defend itself because, quote, they enjoyed great success now evident, and that they did not need, as before, all the inhabitants to defend 7 intersections and various corners or projections present along the Pueblo's exterior. They were able to go on the offensive against the attackers, capable as they were to go and do so behind more than 70 yards of new wall. So these glimmers we get from Dominguez and ANZA point to this real intensification of architectural construction in a defensive sense in this time period, reflective of this rise in Comanche expansion as the empire starts moving forward into New Mexico. Notably, there's that same historian I mentioned a moment ago, Pekka Hamali'inen, who writes about the Comanche Empire, says that to think of New Mexico not being conquered in this time period is really just a matter of perspective. Depending on who you're asking in this time period, New Mexico is rapidly becoming a satellite of a rapidly expanding Comanche empire. Carly, if you would, next slide. This image, which is a detail of Bernardo de Miera y Pacheco's 1779 map that was requested by Juan Bautista de Anza, gives us a sense of this. If you look in the lower left-hand corner of the image, there's some text there, and I know it's a little bit blurry. I was trying to find the very best high-resolution image here, but this is unfortunately the best I could do. It reads, that the text there, poblaciones arruinadas por los enemigos Comanches. That is, little towns and settlements ruined or put in ruins by the enemy Comanches. And you'll notice it's that zone headed down the Rio Grande. There's a small settlement on the east side of the river there. Again, it's blurry, but it says Embudo. What we're looking at are these towns along what today we think of as the sort of open part of the gorge south of Pilar, have all been attacked repeatedly. To visit the area in this time period would be to look at an area that's either sort of burnt out in smoking ruins, or in a few cases we have some plazas and some haciendas that are still holding on for dear life. And again, where we think of today as Los Luceros, that would have been sort of the experience of the time, an era of repeated attack, so much to the point that it would have been potentially very risky to go out and farm and do the thing that would be required for you to subsist in this corner of New Mexico. So Carly, if we would move forward, I want to give you a sense of what things look like a little bit closer to home at what today is the Los Luceros Historic Site. So in that period, the area in and around Santa Cruz de la Cañada was known as an alcaldía, under the direction of an alcalde mayor, a sort of district administrator. And so this district administrator oversaw Santa Cruz, which would have been the largest settlement, a villa, and outlying haciendas, ranchos, and areas in this part of New Mexico that today we kind of associate with the Española region, but extending into Chimayo and upwards up towards the canyon, but inclusive of Los Luceros. There's an interesting connection in this time period with the Martin family. Remember, that goes all the way back to the original land grant with the captain Martin Serrano. According to Eleanor Adams and Angelico Chavez, Captain Sebastian Martin Serrano, the original grantee, also secured some land in the Taos Valley. So in addition to owning what is today Los Luceros, he owned some land in the Taos family, and that land had been inherited by his daughter, Margarita Martin, who married a man named Juan Padilla. Now, Margarita and Juan have a daughter, Josefa, who marries a man known to history as Carlos Fernandez. Fernandez is one of the more colorful and significant players in New Mexico history of the latter half of the 18th century. Fernandez occurs again and again, and I'll be talking about him for two reasons today. He might also be the namesake for Fernandez de Taos, so because of this connection between the two locations, he comes into the Martin Serrano family by way of Taos, but becomes prominent in the Santa Cruz region as well. He becomes alcalde, so again, this district kind of manager or administrator of the Santa Cruz area. And is one of the figures principally responsible for repulsing these repeated Comanche attacks. Just to give you a sense of what things look like in the valley. Remember, in the late 1760s, we have repeated attacks on Ojo Caliente and that area. At around the same time, Taos is now experiencing repeated attacks. We know that in 1769, on the eastern side of the Rio Grande, there's another attack at Piquerí Pueblo, so a little bit closer to what is today Los Luceros. In 1771, Governor Mendinueta attempts to arrive at a truce, a kind of peace settlement. There had been previously two peace arrangements with the Comanches. This, however, does not hold, and by 1774, there's a sort of epic year for Los Luceros. In June of that year, there are attacks at Piquerí again, and also Nambe, further to the south. In July of 1774, though, about 1,000 Comanches descended on Santa Cruz and outlying areas. Ultimately, it appears as though they came along the Chama River, so they would have crossed at that Vargas crossing in the north, came down the Ojo Caliente Valley and into the Chama River Basin. They attack Santa Clara Pueblo, and at Santa Cruz de la Cañada, they catch Carlos Fernandez and a number of pobladores out in the field abutting the town. And it appears as though they're going to be killed, but in fact, this is portrayed as a Spanish victory against the Comanches. The Comanche leader is killed, and Fernandez goes down in history as preventing the worst from happening in 1774. But there are other attacks that follow. In August, there are another round of Comanche attacks at Pecos Pueblo and also at Albuquerque. 60 Comanches trade, though, at the same time peaceably at Taos. Meanwhile, 8 men and about 11 women are locked in another hacienda seeking refuge from an attack at Trucha. So we have, again, these really conflicting interactions with the Comanches. Simultaneous to attacks elsewhere, they're able to undergo peaceful trade in a place like Taos. These are probably different groups, though. Again, we have this curious personality of Cuerno Verde, and we don't know to what extent there might have been some consolidation of a sort of central core of decision-making among some principal elites. But by about September, late September of 1774, after all of these attacks, there is a major offensive coordinated by the Spanish against the Comanches, totaling about 600 individuals, under the command, notably, of Carlos Fernandez. And so Carlos Fernandez, this person who ekes out a victory at Santa Cruz de la Cañada, is appointed to lead a 600-person expedition into the Comanche heartland on the plains of what is today eastern Colorado. And Carly, if you would, next slide. He wins a great victory against the Comanches at one of 2 locations. The sources are a little bit contradictory here. Some of the accounts talk about a battle at Oreja del Conejo, and I have Oreja del Conejo on that upper image. It's out by Clayton, New Mexico. So if you've been out driving on that stretch of road, headed from Capulín National Monument out towards the Texas Panhandle, and you've seen this image on the horizon there, that is essentially Rabbit Ear. And that might have been the location for this 1774 battle in which Fernandez beats a number of Comanches. Or another possibility here arises because of the service record of a soldier by the name of Juan de Dios Peña. He talks about a battle at Huajantoya, which sounds very close to the Comanche pronunciation of Oaxatoya, or what we know better today as the Spanish Peaks. And those are those images, or excuse me, those mountains in the lower image. If you've been near Walsenburg, Colorado, you've certainly seen these so-called Spanish Peaks. This battle occurs at one of those 2 locations. And notably, the record often talks about this as a great Spanish victory. The reality was that it was a mixed campaign. There were a large number of so-called Pueblo auxiliaries, led in most cases by probably a kind of war chief or governor of that Pueblo, and also some Utes who, despite an earlier history of alliance with the Comanches, have now sort of switched sides and joined on a collaboration against the Comanches. So there's a period of shifting alliances here. To be in the area of Los Luceros in this period would have been to experience a world in which there was kind of a brokering of relationships because of the shifting moments and experiences of the time. But I'll return to this 1774 campaign here in a moment as we start to wrap things up. Carly, if you would, next slide. Shortly after the 1774 victory, Juan Bautista de Anza shows up, replacing Pedro Fermín de Mendihuete as governor of New Mexico. And Anza decides that he is going to make good on a proposal put forward by Mendihuete a number of years before to reorganize New Mexico. Anza like Mindanwetha before him, has come to the conclusion that these kind of very dispersed settlements, like what we see in this period at La Soledad, Rio Arriba, again, what today we think of as Los Luceros, were just inimical to the viability of the colony in the long term. Because of repeated attacks from the Comanches, this sort of settlement just seemed doomed to failure. Sooner or later, it's going to be attacked and destroyed. There needs to be a new strategic plan for the colony. To give you a sense of some of the language in this period, because I think it's utterly fascinating how it kind of inverts some of the ways in which the Spanish had conventionally thought of indigenous peoples in this time period. Consider the words by Fray Juan Agustin de Morphy, another person of Irish ancestry. So his last name, Morphy, actually is Murphy. So it's a Hispanicized version of an Irish name. In his account of disorders from 1778, Murphy wrote, quote, "The Pueblo of Sandia has never seen enemies inside its precincts. And here a handful of houses can bring fear to hundreds of warriors. This example teaches nothing to Spaniards, who should be conducting themselves with more propriety and self-discipline than the Indians, but who are not ashamed to prove themselves ruder than the pagans. In all the kingdom of New Mexico, there is not one town of Spaniards in good order." Remember, this is a Spaniard, admittedly of Irish extraction, or ancestry rather, writing about Spaniards, but these are his national kinsmen, so to speak, and this is how he's writing about them. "When it becomes necessary to muster arms for battle or for pursuit of the enemy, our people take so long getting together that the foe has plenty of time to carry out its raid and escape. Many live sunk in misery and without means of attaining for themselves the basic necessities of life because their practice of living dispersed." Okay, so the colonial administrators, the elites, think this is just terrible. Sites like Rio Arriba, again, what today we think of Los Luceros, they're inherently problematic. From a defensive view, they are just not feasible in the long term. ANZA goes so far as to envision rebuilding Santa Fe. And his plan actually involves demolishing an area south of the Santa Fe River known as the Analco. In that time period, this would have been an area of inhabitation by so-called Genízaros, or detribalized or Christian native persons, and essentially rebuilding the plaza of New Mexico south of the river, where today you will find the roundhouse and the other administrative buildings of New Mexico government. So you might imagine this plan doesn't go over well with a lot of the residents. In fact, some abscond all the way to Chihuahua and go and complain to ANZA'S boss. ANZA isn't able to pull this off, but I think it gives you a sense of just how severe the crisis had become. Places like what we think of today as Los Luceros were seen as undefensible, right? They might have coincided with an era of sort of northward expansion, but by the 1770s, they just seem doomed to failure. ANZA sees this as a losing battle, and he's trying to coordinate something new. At around the same time, though, he also launches a major offensive against the Comanches. Carly, if you would, next slide. And I have here the actual record showing the proportions of individuals that went on this campaign. I should mention, not shown here are about 200 Ute and also Jicarilla Apaches who joined the campaign as well. This one is much larger than the 1774 campaign. In sum, it has about 800 individuals. But the third column actually lists those persons from the district of Santa Cruz de la Cañada. And so that district, although it's titled Santa Cruz de la Cañada, would have included sites like Rio Arriba, again, what is today Los Luceros. And so in this list, it includes about 130 New Mexican militia. Almost certainly, some of those individuals must have inhabited the sites around what is today the Los Luceros Historic Site. You'll notice in this list as well, 96 Indios, so including Pueblo participation from places like Oquehuingue, Santa Clara, excuse me, and some of the other neighboring Pueblos. in some, and you'll notice the numbers actually don't originally line up here. One of the archivists or historians went and penciled the correct numbers here and the margin. Something like 246 individuals from the area around Santa Cruz de la Cañada, again inclusive of the Los Luceros Historic Site and what would have been there at that time, went off on a campaign nominally led by ANZA, but also including a number of indigenous leaders and significant numbers of indigenous fighters. And in fact, the Pueblos, Utes, and Jicarilla Apache together vastly outnumber New Mexicans of Spanish origin. So lest we think of this as a Spanish campaign, I really think we have to think about this as a sort of mixed ethnic effort to confront what is clearly a sort of mutual enemy in this time period, who's posing not just kind of a casual threat to continued settlement, but a real existential threat to the viability of this area of the Rio Grande for potentially an entire generation to come. The campaign is by most interpretations a great success. There is ultimately the defeat of Cuerno Verde. Again, this might have been the same Cuerno Verde that appeared in the records in 1768, or it could have been either the son of that individual or a person twice removed. We're not entirely sure, but this particular campaign results in the death of Cuerno Verde, and arguably, and I say arguably because there's a few factors here, arguably a real turning point in the history of Comanche New Mexican relations. Carly, if you would, next slide. There is an intervening smallpox campaign that I don't think should be kind of tossed to the side, that the Comanches might have lost as many as 2/3 of their population because of smallpox in the years 1780 to about 1781. But the real clear turning point here is a 1786 Comanche-Spanish peace agreement that is finalized at Pecos Pueblo when ANZA essentially finalizes an arrangement with a Comanche leader by the name of Cueracapa, who's kind of elected to become the sole representative of all the various Comanche bands, perhaps assuming a role previously played by Cuerno Verde, or perhaps not at all. It's not entirely clear because we don't have great Comanche sources to piece together what's happening. But nonetheless, this kicks off a real turning point, not only in Comanche history, but New Mexican history. Some of you might be familiar with Ross Frank's book that talks about the golden age of colonial New Mexico, and I say golden age in part as a nod to the economic prosperity of the period from about 1786 to 1821. With the Comanche threat broken, New Mexico thrives. In fact, New Mexicans start going into the open plains and trading with the Comanches. There's the beginning of a trade tradition known as the Comancheros, these persons who go out and work with the Comanches and other plains peoples in a trading capacity, becoming kind of the early prehistory of what later emerges as the Santa Fe Trail and the Santa Fe trade with Missouri. But also, many of those outlying areas I spoke about a moment ago, places like Ojo Caliente, the outlying towns around Taos Pueblo are resettled once again. Farming is taken up again. Notably, population explodes in the period from about 1786 to the end of the Spanish period, and a colony that seemed to be on the cusp of disaster starts to move into a sort of steady state by about the turn of the 19th century. I will note here, this is not a great moment in history for everybody. One of the outcomes of the peace settlement with the Comanches is a coordinated Spanish-Comanche offensive against a collection of Apachean peoples that today are mostly associated with the Mescalero. That association of a Mescalero Apache band wasn't really coate in this time period, but essentially the peoples from this time period merged together into becoming later on in time the Mescalero Apaches. And so they're kind of the principal losers in this regard. Not everybody gets along, and the real group that faces the worst because of a cessation of hostilities between Spanish New Mexico and the Comanches are Apaches further to the south and east of the province. Notably, I want to say the Jicarea are a little bit separate. They inhabit an area to the north of the colony, and because of a pretty peaceful history that also for New Mexico involves some offensives against the enemies of New Mexico, they are not targeted in quite the same way. To wrap this up, Carly, if you would move to the last slides, I just want to throw out there that this tradition of los Comanches, other scholars like Enrique Lamadrid have written a lot about this tradition. It is still a festive custom that is celebrated in and around the Los Luceros site. There are traditions of this particular dance and festival being reenacted at Okeowinge Pueblo and other sites there near the Rio Grande in this part of New Mexico. There are about 2 surviving versions, well, I should say 2 very different versions of Los Comanches, and then on the one side, the more conflictive tradition, there's 2 scripts that have survived down unto the present, and they offer an insight into making sense of how contemporaries kind of process this experience of attack by the Comanches with a sort of later history of collaboration and a kind of integration between the Comanches and Spanish-era New Mexico. One of these accounts celebrates the series of Spanish triumphs, you might think of it, kind of appropriating a medieval Spanish tradition of a festival known as Moros y Cristianos, or Moors and Christians. They play off the Comanches as kind of New World Moors, the barbarians who have to be civilized in some sense. And so in that narrative, that production, the Comanches are defeated pretty absolutely. The person who interestingly is given credit for victory over the Comanches is Carlos Fernandez, not ANZA. It's not clear if there's kind of a merging of the 1774 campaign and the 1779 campaign, or because of ANZA's efforts to demolish Santa Fe, he gets kind of a bad name, and so people instead celebrate Fernandez as the good guy, so to speak. But that narrative is very much one of conflict, right? It celebrates kind of these very old, very medieval even tropes about Spanish conquests as a triumph over native peoples in the West. But there's another version of Los Comanches that talks about how essentially the Comanches and the people of New Mexico work out a kind of relationship that allows for, over time, the exchange of mutual ideas and even mutual beliefs, that allows for a viable system of trade to stabilize after 1786 and the resultant peace. And so if you've ever had occasion to hear about Los Comanches, that's kind of what I've tried to present today is a little bit of the backstory there, right? How does all of this feature into a dramatic production, right? These works of art, really, that are these dances and folkloric traditions around Los Comanches emerge out of a historic reality that was emotionally fraught and filled with very violent collisions between peoples from very different backgrounds. And ultimately, I hope it gives you a sense of the present Los Luceros site. Again, most of what exists there today dates to the 19th century as a site with an older history, a history that predates the buildings that you see there. The buildings from the 18th century mostly are in ruins. Parts of them might be part of existing structures today, though that's not for certain or entirely clear. But hopefully a richer understanding, ultimately, of Los Luceros Historic Site. And with that, Carly, we can switch over to the last slide, and that would take us into a Q&A.
Hey, sorry about that. I turned off the screen sharing on accident. But we are good to go. Hi, everybody. Nick, that was amazing. Thank you so much. So the questions that we have here, we have a lot of comments. A lot of people, said thank you, and it was very informative. Let's see, thank you for a great presentation. And I want to be clear, viewers, that you can watch this entire talk over again. Once this live stream ends, it will be published on our Facebook page, and you can watch it whenever you want, because there was definitely a lot of details there. So good to go back and rewatch that. One comment said that Cuerno Verde was Cuerno Verde's son, sort of a CV Jr., and his father was ambushed after a peace talk, so CV Jr. goes on a rampage. So that was one comment. If you had anything to add to that.
Yeah, so the Spanish records tell us he dies 3 times, right? 1768, actually at the hand of Carlos Fernandez in 1774, and then with this encounter with ANZA in 1779. So either somebody is lying, or there's 3 different Cuerno Verdes. And I would say there's not a sort of settled consensus on this. I personally think that what happens is that Cuerno Verde is wounded in 1768. And so the Spanish think he's dead, but he doesn't actually succumb to his wounds, and he comes back to fight another day. I think the 1774 battle, which we know largely through Los Comanches, which is a fictionalized interpretation of that historical event, records his death when in fact he probably didn't die there. The 1779 defeat is decisive ultimately, and so, you know, it's difficult to surmise for certain what's going on here. But that particular viewer is absolutely right. There are a number of historians who have treated the person who dies in 1779 with ANZA as being the son of the senior Cuerno Verde. One of the problems with that theory is that the Comanches don't really have a tradition of hereditary inheritance with regard to titles of sort of political leadership. So just because you have the father dying, it's not automatic the son would sort of replace him. Typically, succession would be by the most capable warrior of sorts. And so this might also be the Spanish imposing sort of Western values of primogeniture and inheritance on a Comanche culture that is very different from their own. But as a historian, we also want to take them at face value, right? The sources are potentially telling us fact, potentially, right? And so it might actually be Cuerno Verde's son. We don't know for sure. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. I thought this was so interesting because we have some postcards in the visitor center of the dances, and I'd never really understood that history. So that really, you know, connected for me as well. And then I know you mentioned earlier that, you know, we're not sure when, you know, if parts of the old buildings were part of it, you know, and so the oldest date, of course, that we have for the hacienda is 1775, and that was from tree ring dating, which, of course, you know, there's a whole thing about like the cutting date of the tree versus when it was actually used versus, you know, the error range for the trees. But I did want to say, you know, just for our viewers, is that we do have a grant in which we will be doing more tree ring dating to see if rooms of the hacienda date back to the time period you're talking about, right? The 18th century, 1700s.
Yeah, and also it's really exciting, right, to be able to get some of that confirmation on dates. One of the challenges, though, as well, and you know, an architectural historian can get a better sense of how the construction was, but oftentimes in this period, because wood was in short supply, you could take a viga or other building materials from one structure and use them again, right? If they're still not compromised for their structural integrity, you can reuse them again. So even though something might have been harvested in 1774, it might have initially been somewhere else, and then it was established at this later location, maybe a generation or two after that. But again, like an architectural historian would be able to look at a beam above it, right, and say, you know, this one is older or younger, and so that tells us maybe something about when this construction took place.
Right, and even with the hacienda, it is quite possible that much of the foundation was from an earlier field house, right? Because this whole area was used for farming, and many times, you know, the Spanish would exactly just kind of appropriate those already, like, materials that were already there into their building. So that's definitely a possibility. Other comments we have, let's see, thank you. Very informative, thank you. You're doing great. This is a great viewership, so really interesting things. Yes, the video will be shareable. And I think that's all we have for questions. So thank you so much for Nick. This was thank you so much, Nick, for this. It was awesome. Do you have any closing remarks?
No, I think that probably wraps it up. Thank you for having me. If you haven't had a chance to get out to Los Luceros, I had a chance to get out there last month. It is truly a splendid place and especially beautiful this time of year. So definitely check it out.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Have a good one.